Understanding Risk, produced by Catholic Charities USA.
Catholic Charities USA is the official domestic disaster relief agency of the United States Catholic Church. Local Catholic Charities agencies serve individuals, families, and communities impacted by disaster events, especially when there is a lack of sufficient resources to recover.
During disaster response and recovery efforts, Catholic Charities USA supports its local agencies in their efforts to provide resources and services to vulnerable survivors. You can learn the role of Catholic Charities USA and local Catholic Charities agencies in the Concept of Operations training video and the Concept of Operations document.
Through training programs like this one, Catholic Charities USA also assists in building agency capacity to serve disaster survivors. Training is available for leadership, management, staff, and volunteers of Catholic Charities USA, local Catholic Charities agencies, and community parishes and churches.
This video first introduces risk assessment as the basis for agency efforts to reduce risk in order to respond and recover quickly and help those who are suffering in the disaster. It then explores the disproportionate disaster risk to socially vulnerable populations and opportunities for Catholic Charities agencies to identify and assist in reducing that risk in collaboration with partners. Main topics include: what is disaster risk? Assessing risks to Catholic Charities agencies, risk reduction opportunities for agencies, assessing risks to vulnerable populations, and risk reduction opportunities for vulnerable populations.
The participant guide that accompanies this video includes a summary of the video content, worksheets for activities that apply or review important concepts, and resources to use later when assessing risks to your agency and your community.
What is disaster risk?
Scenes of natural disaster events appear so often on the media that many of us remember them only until the next one occurs, or until one affects our own community. Too many Catholic Charities agencies have already experienced horrific disaster events and understand the impacts and consequences, but even experience does not guarantee readiness for the next disaster. Every year, new areas are affected, and hazard events are different or more severe than ever before.
There are a few terms used in discussing risk that are defined in more than one way, and it is important to have a common understanding with everyone involved in your process. Catholic Charities USA uses common language that aligns with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Definitions are included in the participant guide.
A hazard is a source of potential danger or adverse condition. Natural hazards are acts of nature, including weather events like drought, flooding, freezing, severe storms, hurricanes, wildfire, and winter storms, and physical events like earthquakes and volcanoes. Flooding is the most frequent and costliest natural disaster facing the United States.
Technological hazards originate from accidents or failures of built structures or systems, and human-caused hazards arise from intentional human actions to threaten or harm the well-being of others.
Risk is a combination of the probability that a hazard event will occur and the consequences of its occurrence. This video focuses on risks from natural hazards, but the risk assessment process is the same for all hazards.
Assessing risks to Catholic Charities agencies.
Within the U.S. National Preparedness System, state and local governments are guided to complete a standard threat and hazard identification and risk assessment, called a THIRA. The local THIRA identifies risks that have the potential to greatly challenge a community's capabilities. It exposes areas of risk in which the community may not have the capability to respond should that risk become a reality.
FEMA also provides guidance for organizations within the community, like nonprofits and businesses, to effectively assess their hazard risks. That guidance assesses risk through an impact analysis process.
This video references elements from both processes that will help Catholic Charities agencies identify and enhance opportunities to prepare for and reduce hazard risk before an event occurs.
Identify the hazards. Whether beginning a new risk assessment or updating an existing one, the first step is to identify relevant hazards, focusing on the ones that are likely to occur in the local community and will negatively impact at least one of the essential functions of the local Catholic Charities agency. There are multiple sources of information about hazards and their potential effects.
Review any preparedness work your agency has already completed. For example, an emergency operations plan, a previous risk assessment, or a site survey of the agency's property. Your diocesan management office may have information that can assist your assessment process.
Don't hesitate to ask your local emergency manager for information. The community's THIRA, its Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan, and its Hazard Mitigation Plan contain information about potential threats and hazards.
Contact Catholic Charities USA about the interactive disaster operations map that provides a broad picture of the hazards likely to affect your area and the vulnerable population that could be affected. This map will be demonstrated later in the video.
If the initial list is long, answering the following questions will help narrow the focus. Have there been any past occurrences of the hazard events in or near the community? What location or geographical areas would be affected when the event occurs? What has been the magnitude or severity when this hazard event has occurred in the past? What is the likelihood and probable frequency of the event occurring again or for the first time?
When the list has been narrowed, find out if there has been any action taken to mitigate the impact of a hazard, making it less likely to affect the agency or community. For example, if the community passed codes or ordinances that have created fuel breaks and adequate water supply to wildfire hazard areas.
Conversely, if there are any known conditions on an agency's property or in the community that may worsen a hazard's impact, note them. For example, the stormwater drainage system may have failed in previous storms, and repairs are not yet complete.
Environmental stressors also exist. Consecutive days or months of a heat wave or drought may create potential for casualties and damage that normally do not exist.
It is useful to transfer hazard information to a map, either digital or paper. An example is the National Flood Hazard Layer, which provides the ability to explore current digital flood hazard data on a map. Hazard maps may be available already in one of the plans mentioned earlier, or your agency can develop its own.
Give the hazards context. The next step in assessing risk to agency operations is to look at what assets could be affected by a hazard event. One way to organize this step is to look at people, property, and administrative processes.
People. People are always considered first. Could agency staff, volunteers, family members, and clients be injured or isolated by this type of hazard event?
Property. What physical assets might be affected? Consider agency offices, clinics, senior centers. Markets, food pantries, vehicles, parking lots, supplies, and other tangible assets like communication equipment. What critical structures and infrastructure in the community could be affected?
Agency administration. What systems may be affected that are taken for granted in the day-to-day operation of the agency? Staff pay and benefits? Tracking services? Financial support for Catholic Charities services? Will banking, internet, or phone service be affected?
Assess the impact. Depending on where, when, and under what conditions a hazard event occurs, the impact may be different. These different scenarios have to be considered before making decisions about which risks call for preparedness or risk reduction efforts.
Consider this example. The building that houses the agency's food bank is in a special flood hazard area. It will take on water if the river exceeds a certain depth. If the river rises slowly over days or weeks, it may be possible to relocate the food bank operation, including staffing and supplies and tracking systems, to an alternate location. But if the flooding occurs as a result of a supercell thunderstorm that drops 20 inches of rain in a day, it may be impossible to do anything to prevent or mitigate the consequences beyond getting staff to safety. The impact on the facility and the food bank operation could be devastating.
For each scenario, consider these questions. Where are greatest damages likely to occur? Which essential assets will be operational after an event? Would prevention or mitigation actions benefit the agency's ability to function after the hazard event? Can the actions be implemented?
At the end of this analysis, agencies have the basis for developing or updating strategies for reducing risk of damage to agency capabilities before the event occurs. Emergency operations plans to protect people and prevent damage to the extent possible when an event occurs, and continuity of operations plans to identify alternatives and procedures for continuing critical functions.
The participant guide includes a sample risk assessment table that may be useful in assessing the impacts of potential hazard events on your agency's ability to serve. There are many emergency planning resources and training opportunities available from FEMA and from Catholic Charities USA. Links are included in the participant guide.
Risk reduction opportunities for agencies.
Understanding and prioritizing hazard risks enables Catholic Charities agencies to explore which impacts can be reduced by investing in risk reduction actions, also known as hazard mitigation. If there's a potential for significant impacts, creating a hazard mitigation strategy should be a high priority of the agency. Engineering and science demonstrate that hazard risk reduction is possible. Here are just a few examples.
In hurricane risk areas, agencies can protect their buildings with hurricane shutters, wind-resistant glass, reinforced roofs, and hardened structural components. Trees that might fall and damage buildings can be removed.
In tornado risk areas, safe rooms can help provide near absolute protection for staff and clients from injury or death. The area used for a conference room or other purpose can be adapted for life safety protection.
If one or more of an agency's facilities repeatedly floods, the most effective mitigation methods are relocation or elevations. If this is not feasible, some flood-proofing alternatives include elevating electrical and mechanical systems and utilities, grading to drain water away from the building, and sealing cracks with waterproof material.
In a wildfire risk area, agency facilities can be protected by fire-resistant roofing and building materials, and by maintaining landscaping according to FireWise standards that demonstrate how to live with wildfire risk.
In earthquake risk areas, agencies can take non-structural mitigation steps to prevent both large and small objects from falling and causing injuries, and can brace critical components like HVAC equipment and electrical cabinets. New facilities can be built according to earthquake-resistant designs. References for these and other hazard risk reduction measures may be found in the participant guide.
Funding and collaboration. Ideally, risk reduction steps are taken before a disaster occurs, but permanent solutions to hazard risk problems can be expensive. If hazard risk threatens an agency's ability to perform its mission and there are inadequate resources to mitigate it, there are some options. Communities are eligible to apply for mitigation grants not open to voluntary organizations directly. Close collaboration with local emergency management and other local government agencies is important if a Catholic Charities agency wants to be included in a community's long-term risk reduction projects.
FEMA's Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program is now the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, to support hazard mitigation projects in communities. The purpose is to shift the federal focus away from reactive disaster spending and toward research-supported proactive investment in community resilience. After a federal disaster declaration, FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds may be available through communities to private nonprofits that provide essential social services.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, also offers eligible grantees assistance to carry out mitigation activities in areas impacted by recent disasters. HUD requires that recipients of Community Development Block Grant Mitigation Funds expend at least 50% for activities that benefit low to moderate income persons.
Also, remember that purchasing insurance is a way to reduce the financial impact of loss or damage to a facility, supplies, equipment, and even fundraising efforts. Losses caused by flood, earthquake, or even wind may not be covered by standard property insurance policies, so it is important for agencies to have the right coverage.
Consider setting up a meeting with the local emergency program manager who can help with local information and guidance. It will be mutually beneficial to become part of the local multi-hazard mitigation planning team. That involvement may result in valuable technical assistance and opportunities to obtain grant assistance for risk reduction projects.
Other voluntary agencies active in disaster, VOADs, may have conducted their own risk assessments or mitigated hazard risk and may be willing to share insights.
Agency risk reduction activity. When the video is paused, please turn to the agency risk reduction activity in the participant guide. Based on current knowledge of hazards affecting your agency, estimate risk level for each: none, low, medium, or high. Then jot down ideas for actions to mitigate one or more high-priority risks before that event occurs and what funding options are available.
This activity was a much simplified version of the actual processes for risk assessment and development of a hazard mitigation strategy, intended only to stimulate thought and discussion. Please refer to the participant guide for additional references when your agency embarks on either process.
Assessing risks to vulnerable populations.
There is more to understanding risk than the physical damage that can be sustained. Given the same disaster event, some people are at greater risk of negative experiences, effects, and reactions. These are often the people served by Catholic Charities.
The research to support this topic is cited in the participant guide, but any Catholic Charities agency that has experienced a disaster already knows this fact. Social vulnerability refers to the socioeconomic and demographic circumstances that exist prior to a disaster, which may weaken ability to prevent human suffering and financial loss when an event like a natural disaster occurs.
In the index developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, social vulnerability is determined for a given area by the social factors for which the U.S. Census collects data. The data is categorized into 4 main areas: socioeconomic status, household composition, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. Here are a few examples of how social factors combine with hazard risk to create increased vulnerability.
People with low socioeconomic status are unlikely to afford the more expensive preparedness actions, such as flood or earthquake insurance, and make home improvements to increase resilience. One report shows that 75% of renters who make less than $30,000 do not maintain any renter's insurance. When their homes and possessions are damaged, there is no financial net for recovery.
They may not respond to evacuation warnings because they cannot afford a hotel or to buy food or have access to a vehicle to leave.
Their health may fare more poorly in certain disaster types, like heat waves and freezing, if lacking funds for utilities.
People with fewer assets or who are unemployed have more obstacles to receiving assistance, like loans for repair and rebuilding.
People with less education are likely to have more trouble navigating bureaucracy of government disaster assistance and thus recover more slowly and less fully.
Some socially vulnerable households that include elderly, children, or a disabled member may not have the physical capability to prepare for disasters or to survive extreme conditions without help. The impacts of these factors may be devastating. A study showed that in 3 heavily affected Louisiana parishes, while only 6% of pre-Katrina residents were over 75 years of age, almost half of the fatalities were people in that category.
Limited English proficiency may affect ability to receive or trust warnings and other instructions, particularly for those whose first language is neither English nor Spanish. Citizenship status may affect ability to apply for government disaster assistance.
Housing that is affordable but built with poor construction or located in areas that lack access to services or reliable infrastructure is more likely to sustain damage. Crowded housing areas are more difficult to evacuate. Most mobile homes are not designed to withstand tornado winds or flooding. Flooded mobile homes that are not repaired immediately may never again be livable due to mold intrusion.
How can a Catholic Charities agency even plan for assisting its community's vulnerable population to withstand and recover from likely hazard events? As with any emergency planning process, it is necessary to first understand the risk. The process is similar to that described earlier for assessing risk to the agency's assets and capabilities. But the geographic area to consider can be many times larger and the circumstances widely varied.
The local emergency management agency's THIRA should be an excellent source of community risk information. In addition, Catholic Charities USA offers a tool to help agencies serve communities that are both at greater risk for disasters and most overlooked or excluded from federal disaster assistance.
The map can be used to strategically allocate resources to reduce risk and prepare before disasters, and to identify where vulnerable populations live after a disaster event occurs. Zach Cahalan of Catholic Charities USA will walk us through a demonstration of how to use this valuable tool.
Welcome to the demonstration for the Catholic Charities USA Disaster Operations Map. First and foremost, we want to thank our generous partners, Mapbox here in DC, as well as Dedikind DC, a nonprofit group that helped make this amazing product possible. Now first, how do you access the map? If you're a CCUSA member agency, you can go through the resource portal and access it through that route, but this is available to anyone, regardless of CCUSA affiliation. So to do so, you would just go to your search engine of choice, and then I use Google here, CCUSA Disaster Map. You'll see it's the first hit. You'll go ahead, click that, and that brings you to this screen here. Now about the data that comprises this map, We can go into great detail here on the Data tab, and you can also, if you're a coder, access the GitHub page and learn even more about how all of this works behind the scenes. Primarily, this is pulling from two data sets, the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, as well as the Natural Hazard Housing Risk Index. The Social Vulnerability Index has a few main components you can see here, and then subcomponents that are particularly relevant under each of those categories. Now, when we look at this map, it's generally color-coded from a light color here to a dark color that's really dark navy blue. As you get darker, that's indicating the presence of more vulnerabilities. Now, if you had a desire to look at only one type of vulnerability, perhaps you were doing translation services, or whatever the case may be, you might want to look at minority status and language vulnerability for the work that you may be undertaking. So you could do that with any of these categories. I'm going to leave it on overall for now, leave the hazard risk as well, default set to overall, and go ahead and turn off the data overlay tab. Now, before diving too much further, you'll see that there's already some information presented on the menu to our right, and that's indicating the vulnerability information we have, as well as the risk information, where you have this dark blue outline. And so when you're at a zoomed out level, it's pulling up that information at a county level. So we can see here we're in Cook County, Minnesota, the Catholic Diocese that's affiliated with it, and so on and so forth on all of these different vulnerabilities. We've got the one here for age 65 and over. Now, this map is mobile friendly. You zoom in just as you would on a phone, like a photo, by pinching and pulling with your fingers. For today's presentation, I'm using a laptop, no mouse, and I'm going to be doing the same thing on my touchpad. So I'm going to zoom in a bit more and get to Fairfax County, which is right over here. So we see here for Fairfax County that there's only two flags that popped up. And what really does that mean? I mentioned the flag before when we looked at Cook County, Minnesota. So let's take a look. Again, get it back on Fairfax. And we can do that and not have it lose where we are by pulling the map over. This is a relative index, all right? So we're seeing a percentile relative to the rest of the country. Index scores, as you can see on this little explainer, range from 0 to 1. The closer to 1.0 you get, essentially if you have a score of 1 on a vulnerability, there is not another county that has a more acute level of that vulnerability. Again, a percentile basis. So if we see here something at the 91st percentile, that would mean only 9% of other counties are in those percentiles greater than yours. And so 90 or higher is pretty acute. So we've set this up to flag those for you so you can quickly see what vulnerabilities are being displayed. Now, if I'm looking to do some form of, spinning the map there, disaster operations work, I might look at this and see that there's only a couple of vulnerabilities I need to take into account if I'm going to do some work in Fairfax County. However, a county level really masks a lot of the hyperlocal information that can really be relevant when you look to do your work, especially with a mission to reach the vulnerable and underserved. So I'm going to zoom in further, and automatically what the map will do, once you reach a certain point, you can see that my blue outline here has gotten much smaller. It's now pulling from a census tract level. So now I can do this over multiple small areas of Fairfax County. And I might find that there are areas with a lot more vulnerabilities. And by using my color coding, I can quickly see this area here has very many. And I might need to take this into account for the type of service delivery I may be looking to do, whether it be preparedness, response, recovery, or even mitigation. So that's a quick overview of the map and its capabilities. I hope you find this helpful as you continue to explore more hazard, risk, exposure, and how that impacts the way you continue your ongoing work. Thank you so much.
Risk reduction opportunities for vulnerable populations. Catholic Charities agencies may be able to find ways to assist in reducing risk to vulnerable people.
One important role is to advocate for proper protection of high-risk areas populated by socially vulnerable people. The advocacy needed will depend on the hazards and social vulnerability risks of a particular community, but a few examples include making community shelters available for speedy access by residents of mobile homes located in tornado risk areas, zoning that prohibits future mobile homes and any other housing in areas of high flood risk, land use planning in areas of wildfire risk, adopting and implementing building codes, warning and evacuation procedures that focus on children, the elderly, and the disabled, joining the National Flood Insurance Program.
Increasing knowledge about preparedness is another way to reduce risk of injury and hasten recovery. The Catholic Disaster Preparedness Program, developed by Catholic Charities USA, can be offered to parishes to train individuals and families in preparedness and to train parishes in disaster planning and community support during disasters. Links to the videos are in the participant guide.
Agencies may be able to help vulnerable people directly by providing information and access to training about less expensive risk reduction measures, and or by providing financial or volunteer assistance to do the work. Here are a few suggestions for lower-cost risk reduction actions. References are included in the participant guide.
In areas that repeatedly flood, regularly clear debris from drains, ditches, downspouts, and gutters. Move valuable papers and possessions to safe locations above the flood elevation and keep in watertight containers. And install drain plugs where sewer backup could occur.
In earthquake hazard areas, move or anchor objects that can fall on people or block escape routes. Secure computers and TVs with straps, and install latches on kitchen cabinets.
In high wind risk areas, suggestions for reducing risk include removing diseased or damaged tree limbs and minimizing any debris or loose items in the yard. For tornadoes, knowing where the closest storm shelter is located and how to get there when warning is received.
In wildfire hazard areas, clearing or reducing combustible vegetation and debris around the home removes fuel for the fire.
In areas where heat waves affect many elderly and others, agencies can reduce risk by identifying or providing places that will be cool, having a supply of fans, and/or assisting with electric bills to keep air conditioners and fans working.
One of the most important mitigation measures that is sometimes unreachable to the socially vulnerable is insurance. Some insurance companies recognize this issue and are developing better programs for low-income renters and homeowners. It is important to educate or assist clients to access the state's insurance commissioner to check on insurance companies and obtain resources such as rate comparison tools.
Funding and collaboration. The federal grant programs described earlier in the video may offer some opportunities for reducing hazard risk to vulnerable populations. Other sources of funding and donations for long-term risk reduction may become available after a disaster or an anniversary of a particularly catastrophic event.
Collaborate with the community to be ready to take advantage of every mitigation funding opportunity that becomes available. Collaborate with other VOADs to present a strong voice for ensuring mitigation projects positively impact high-risk vulnerable populations.
Volunteers can also be a great resource for implementing the low-cost and relatively simple risk reduction steps described earlier, particularly if donations can be obtained to provide the tools and inexpensive hardware needed.
When the video is paused, please turn in your participant guide to the activity called Reducing Risk to the Socially Vulnerable. If possible, refer to the CCUSA Disaster Operations Map and select a hazard risk that affects any category socially vulnerable people in your diocese? If not, select based on prior knowledge of your hazard risks and the population you serve. Brainstorm ways your agency may be able to advocate for or assist in reducing risk to that group.
Wrap up. Effective disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and hazard mitigation all require an understanding of risk. Catholic Charities agencies can assess risk to their own organizations and to their communities, and then use this information to better serve and support vulnerable populations who will be affected by disasters. For more information, email disasteroperations@catholiccharitiesusa.org or call Catholic Charities USA at 703-549-1390.